Hey guys, for those of you here, welcome to Developing Astroneer, charting new and challenging courses. My name is Brendan Wilson. I'm the studio head and one of the co-founders of System Era. There's my Twitter handle. It's probably the best place to find me, and at the end maybe we can do questions and I'll be around to chat. So enough about me. This talk is going to be about Astroneer, and I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the game. I'm going to talk about our philosophy related to the specific challenges we faced and still face. And at the end I'm going to cover part of how we leverage Microsoft's distribution platform tools to help remain focused on those core challenges. It's a relatively short talk, so I'll try to stay brief, but after the talk is over, you should stick around for Bernardo Zamora's talk immediately following this one, which will go into more detail about the capabilities of the store. So System Era started in 2014 with 4 founders, including myself, all experienced developers who shared a desire to work on games for broad audiences and to see how much we could get done entirely ourselves. So we were bootstrapped with our own funds and some friends and family help, and we are entirely self-published. And we kind of came together over a common interest in aerospace and space exploration and its modern private industry renaissance, and hope to make a game that could inspire people to become interested in that subject. So our first game became Astroneer. Astroneer is a space exploration sandbox where you kind of play, either alone or in co-op with friends as these sort of adorable vanguards of humanity in distant solar systems. We released in December of 2016 into game preview on Xbox and the Microsoft Store, and as a cross-platform XPA title, and simultaneously into early access on Steam. To show off what the game looks like, I'm just going to kind of shamelessly play the trailer for our last major update, which came out last month and introduced some of the new mechanics for manipulating and building the base elements in your space base. And it focuses on the new features, but it still captures a lot of the overall gameplay. Okay, so we'll go over some of what we saw there. So I'm going to start by posing the question, how hard should it be to make your game? If you set your bar too low and give yourself too easy of a time, then it's very likely that you are not innovating much and won't be differentiated. The hardest challenges you face in designing and implementing your game are make or break. They're going to pose a risk that you fail or don't ship your game, but if you solve them, they can make your game stand tall and give you a competitive edge in the marketplace. So Astroneer, even though in a budgetary sense, it's the smallest game I've ever worked on, it's also the hardest game I've ever worked on. And I'm going to briefly go over our riskiest features and why we chose not to cut them. So exploration of new lands was a pillar for Astroneer, and we wanted to capture that sense of anticipation as you round the next bend or crest the next rise. And we wanted to offer players the ability to retain that sense through multiple playthroughs. So procedural generation seemed like the natural way to achieve that goal. It's very tricky to get right though, and we are continually investing in our tech. So a big challenge is generating content that's both novel for the player and adds to replayability, but is consistently enjoyable to play with in the first place, without being overly repetitive. It's a tool that can be used to generate expansive environments with a reduced burden on art content, but you still have to spend a lot of time tuning and curating the output and weaving in handcrafted elements to ensure that you're getting good results. Balance and your player progression, since you're not completely non-linear, are a lot harder to manage. So you might set a particularly rare item to appear only a few times on the planet, and then anticipate that the player is going to take like hours to find it, only to have it spawn right next to the start location. Or conversely, your random distribution of resources creates early game situations where the player is starved and can't progress. So this means you start creating more rules defining context between your procedural elements, and the complexity curve and execution costs can ramp up very quickly. So the other big feature was deformability. So the terrain is all procedural, it's also fully deformable, the entire planet. Part of the original elevator pitch for the game was the line, Astroneer is to Play-Doh as Minecraft is to Lego. And we're not the only game to do this kind of thing, but probably the only one that I know of at least to do it to this extent. And this one's interesting because in many ways it mitigates some of the problems that procedural generation can leave you with. So you don't have to ensure that all of the content is placed in a way that's conveniently accessible when players can just build their own ramps and roads and tunnels to reach things. At the same time, that's a lot of power to give players, and it presents this tension between offering the player creative freedom and challenging them through constraint. And it's a technical challenge when the player can affect literally anything in the world, and you still need to efficiently persist those state changes, be able to restore from them, make it all work in multiplayer as well. The other big thing, probably the biggest standout feature in Astroneer is the diegetic interactions. Diegetic refers to elements that are rendered in the world in a way that the characters would be able to see and interact with them. So a HUD overlay with a health meter is non-diegetic, but like a readout on an oxygen tank rendered in the world, that would be diegetic. And in Astroneer, we made this conscious decision to make as many of the interactions and elements in the game as possible completely diegetic. And this video is actually showing the least of those in that we're rendering semi-diegetic elements on in-world diegetic control panels. So the game features no persistent HUD at all, and the player knows the state of their character by looking directly at the character. So this direction kind of emerged out of a desire for clever improvisation to be a big part of the gameplay. We wanted Apollo 13, we wanted Mark Watney, tinkering and jury rigging. We wanted that process to feel alive and deeply interactive. And so we turned to each other and we were like, what if everything in the game was done completely in-world? The great thing about the approach is that the interactions all of a sudden become part of the fun. So suddenly, you're not clinically interacting with menus, you are just kind of playing with your stuff. And it brings out this kind of tactile joy, like you get from physical toys. And we had the unexpected side benefit as well, which was that by placing all the interactions directly in the world, the game lent itself to the streamer and the YouTube crowd because it's so easy to learn by watching. One of my favorite early videos from one of our streamers involved him playing multiplayer with a friend and learning the game's interactions by having his friend demonstrate them in world, literally in front of him, for both him and his audience to see. So that was great. The biggest problem for us is that the art and the UX design become bound much more tightly than ordinary. So as an example, here's the furnace from Minecraft. It's clean, it's consistent with the game's art style. It looks like a real-world oven, so it tells tells the player what it is, what it does. But the art has nothing to do with how you interact with this. You walk up to it, press a button, and you get a menu. The closest equivalent in Astroneer is this object, the smelter. It looks nothing like a real-life smelter. It features these input and output slots built onto the mesh in the front in an accessible way. There are exactly 4 input slots, which gives you some built-in storage. And so our game artists, in building something like this, have to double as industrial designers, building things like your iPhone, in order to make anything usable. And simple balance changes, like the number of input slots, require a whole new art pass. But this is a kind of a cost that we chose to accept to deliver that tactile experience. So we have a third-person dynamic controllable camera in the game. Third-person cameras are the hardest thing in any game in terms of the perspective. You've got to worry about the camera colliding with objects, with breaking line of sight with the character. The movement of the camera has to be fluid and stable, or it can be disruptive and nauseating. And your controls are more complicated if you can control the camera, because now the character movement and camera movement are decoupled and require separate inputs. And then very often you need different algorithms for the camera that are suited to different contexts. So given these issues, why didn't we just use first person? First person is the easy choice that most games in our genre use. First of all, the diegetic approach demands in-world where the in-world interactions, it kind of demands a third-person camera. So all the information about your character is presented on the character itself. So if the character is not visible, then that information is hidden from the player without some sort of non-diegetic UI. And the second reason is aesthetic. So I think that there's a big tonal difference between first and third person perspectives in games. First person perspective places the player at the center of this center stage of the story, pushing the identity of their avatar into the background. So this emphasizes immersion, but it gives little attention to the character you're playing as, which makes it harder to build a relationship with the character. Third person perspective places the character at center stage, and the player sort of exists like the proverbial angel or devil on their shoulders. Helps to create that sense of separate identities and emphasizes empathy over immersion. And so that's a tone that we wanted to hit with Astroneer, especially because the characters are going to be so often alone on these huge planets. The third person perspective kind of alleviated that sense of solitude by, in effect, having two people, the character and the player, kind of separate identities helping each other progress. Okay, of course, we've got multiplayer as well, and this is, you throw multiplayer into the mix and everything gets harder. The value proposition of multiplayer for a game like Astroneer was too great for us to resist. We were pretty cavalier in our early scoping, a lot of features that we had to cut. I remember talking with a publisher colleague when we were showing the single player game off a couple of years ago, and he asked me, are you going to do multiplayer? And I'm like, yeah, we're going to have co-op at launch, we're going to have all these features. First question was, okay, who's your QA company? He knew better than me how much multiplayer compounds the technical difficulty. And Astroneer has a bunch of features that are hard to mix with MP. We've got the diegetic approach, places tons of physically interactive objects into the world at all times, often interacting in complex ways, all of which has to be network replicated. A lot of our bugs relate to those network state issues. We have the procedural generation has to be guaranteed deterministic across all players, across different hardware. We have to keep the world synchronized as potentially every player is deforming the terrain. And we have these solar systems where each player can be on different planets all at the same time. And so having all of that going on at once is a lot for a host machine to deal with. So it led us to the compromise of restricting the player count to 4 until we can sufficiently optimize those scenarios. And then we have spherical worlds, spherical gravity. Not too difficult to implement, but when you're using middleware, all of your middleware is designed for completely flat worlds and bakes in that assumption all throughout the code. So you become kind of restricted to either implementing your things yourself or using only middleware where you have source access and you can make the necessary modifications. Okay. So back to the original question, how hard should it be to make your game? For us, our answer was, at least in part, as hard as possible. We chose to do a lot of things, kind of the hard way, or meaning as challenging for our team as possible in as many areas as possible, beyond what we knew for certain to actually be possible for us. We argued about this for a while, but we ultimately thought this might be the only game that we ever get to make. There's a lot of other great games out there. The only way that we get to see what we can make is if we push the envelope as far as we can. I keep saying as possible, which gets to the second part of the answer. All of the examples I gave of the challenges that we faced were problems in and of the game itself, which kind of mirrors how we spent most of our time. We spent nearly all of our time working on the game, a little bit on raising awareness, and almost none, very little, on what I'll call publishing work. So publishing work is all of the kind of go-to-market work that was and still often is handled by third-party publishers, but it's increasingly becoming rolled into the distribution platforms, the store platforms, and as an independent developer, you have to fully leverage these. This is how you end up efficiently spending your time where you need to on the game. So let's start with job number 1 from a publisher's perspective. Job 1 is getting the game to your total addressable market. You want to make your game available to as many people as possible in as many countries as possible around the world. So naively, that means getting your game into as many stores as possible. The problem is there are like 1 million stores out there, and as soon as your game is nearing release, they're all going to be clamoring for you to get your game in them. All of them bring an overhead cost is the problem. In terms of the time you're spending on distributing updates to those stores, managing those storefronts, administrating multiple revenue streams, and the overhead is about the same for every store, no matter how big of a market share that they have. So you're, especially as an indie, maybe bigger teams can afford to manage all of that, but as an indie, you're getting into diminishing returns very quickly. To the point where a lot of the stores are not even worth the time it takes to answer their emails. So we wanted to be in as few stores as possible, especially being a multiplayer game without our own sort of separately implemented backend. We're relying on the platform backends. We didn't want to bifurcate the multiplayer user base. And we wanted to focus on outlets that would guaranteed be global reach, and multilingual. So we chose Steam and the Microsoft Store and the Humble Store. Steam being the mandatory, it's mandatory for the PC market. And Humble is a Steam key reseller strictly, so they kind of half count. And then that leaves the Microsoft Store. This was interesting. It's pretty new when we were developing. We were skeptical at first, but when it comes down to it, I thought that they're basically the only other store on PC that has that same or better global reach than Steam does. It's pre-installed on every Windows machine, so you don't have that double concern of building awareness of your game and building awareness of the stores that your game is available in. We were already implementing for the Xbox, so we could be an Xbox Play Anywhere title. That means that you buy, it's one store, it's one SKU, you buy it in the Windows or the Microsoft Store, you get it for Windows, you get it for any device that the game is compatible with. And the two versions of the game for Windows and for Xbox have cross-platform compatible cloud saves, they're cross-platform multiplayer, so far from splitting the user base, this was unifying the user base. So I talked about that global and multilingual reach. The Microsoft Store, it's in the minority of stores that has really comprehensive support for localized storefronts. And you're required to localize for any language that you say that your game supports. I'm just going to kind of go on an aside about localization because I've encountered other indie devs who are kind of waffle about localization. They say, it's kind of expensive for us, it's a lot of time, and we're not sure it's going to be worth it. So I'm just putting this chart up. This is the breakdown of our PC unit sales by country. So you can see there's 31% only in the US. The other is like every other country that doesn't fit. This is the same chart, broken up by language, native English speaking versus non-native English speaking. So that's over 50% non-native English speaking countries where our game is being sold. So this to me is like you have to localize. Localize your game, localize your storefronts, because if you don't, you're kind of crazy. This is like a lot to leave on the table.
Which languages would you localize?
Well, I'll go back to the other slides. So these were the top countries for us. So we're localized in 14 languages. All of these, definitely China is number 2 for us, and then you want to hit the major Western European countries and Russia. So if you had to do like 5, I would take these. Probably China, Russia, Germany, France, maybe Korea. Those are definitely the best for us. But there's other languages that are kind of coming up. Like we added Turkey late. There's kind of the Middle East is kind of a new emerging market for games. They want to get localized. Definitely worth it for us. Okay, how about age ratings? We were very conscious that we wanted the game to be playable by kids, which means that parents are going to be the ones making the purchasing decisions. Parents pay attention to ratings. I get emails about this. And so it was important to us that we got rated. And we were releasing on the Xbox. Xbox certification requires age ratings. And the problem is that age ratings are a total nightmare. This is a picture that I took 2 years ago. Where I was mapping, this is like pre-release, and I was mapping our targeted countries against the languages that we wanted to localize for and the ratings agencies that we would have to that we'd have to submit to. Might be, I don't know if you can read it, but there are 11, there's some duplicates there, but there's 11 different agencies listed. Every agency has unique, complex submission requirements, and the full rating submissions are often expensive. Like you're talking thousands of dollars per submission. So this is the kind of barrier to entry that used to make it very hard for indie developers to self-publish. And at the time, I was like, this is impossible. We're going to get preliminary ratings from ESRB and PEGI and just not launch in any other country where they don't have jurisdiction. The same year that we were to go launch in the Microsoft Store, Microsoft announced that they would roll out a partnership with the IARC, or IARC. So IARC stands for the International Age Rating Coalition. It's an organization that partners with all of the national ratings agencies to provide developers like us a standard, simplified way to submit for ratings for digital-only titles. And it's completely free. Like it was created in order to fill the demand created by the mobile app stores and the volume of apps that were coming through. But it applies to larger games. As long as you're digital only, you can go through IARC. So we could be rated worldwide at no cost. And because we were a Play Anywhere title and sold through the Microsoft Store, the IARC ratings would apply to our Xbox version as well. Huge boon to us. This is like the dashboard that you'll see through the Microsoft Store. You do your submission, and then the report comes back a little while later, and you get to see all of the ratings that you were assigned for all the individual agencies. I think without this, we would not have been able to release in as many countries as we wanted to. It's definitely one of my favorite features of the Windows Store, the Microsoft Store. They changed the name in October. Okay, so telemetry. Live ops is increasingly important. You'll see that with PlayFab is being demoed over there. At the very least, you should be collecting the most basic telemetry about your game to know the size, the composition, the retention patterns of your players, so you know that the impact of the updates you're having. We're an early access game. We're updating monthly. This is hugely important. Not many platforms offer any built-in data. So for our Steam release, we were pretty much flying blind until we had integrated some third-party services for this kind of telemetry, and a second service for crash reporting. And for a small indie self-published game, again, these are kind of distractions from the core problems of the game. On the Windows Store, though, this was not the case at launch, so it comes built in with I would say, a pretty solid essentials package of telemetry. So you get your DAU, MAU, weekly retention cohorts, and you get some cool information about Xbox Live players, what kind of Xbox Live players are playing your game. You get the volunteer survey information that they provided, that talks about gender, talks about age, and this was super valuable to us. Oh, you also get crash reporting built in, for your EWP apps. Again, in the early days, this was basically our only window into what was going on in the game, and we kind of had to project that on the rest of the market. Super valuable. And the last thing I'm going to talk about for the store is the certification process. It's a little controversial, right? So the Microsoft Store does have a certification process. Yes, it does mean that builds can't get pushed out quite as fast as without a cert process. But from the perspective of an indie developer who's never published a game before, I would say that this was pretty beneficial to us. So we had a QA budget with an outsourced QA partner, but it was quite limited. It was focused on functional testing. The cert teams within Microsoft kind of functioned as that extra QA group and a last line of defense. So even though we were a game preview title, they allow us to be buggy to some extent, and we had to go through only a limited cert pass. It still took us 5 tries because they kept finding these edge case bugs that we wouldn't have caught. A lot of things related to multiplayer connectivity and specific scenarios with your friends lists that would have given players a really hard time for those that encountered it. It's a comprehensive cert process, so they certify your marketing metadata, your storefront stuff as well, to make sure that that's free of nasty errors. It's more common than you'd think to make nasty mistakes on your storefront that go out into the wild. So you get your regional pricing set up correctly, all of which that's all giving you an extra layer of security that you would ordinarily need to spend a lot more on QA to get. The other thing about cert is that, especially for any console developers, they know that in the past, cert has been a kind of prohibitively expensive process that a lot of indie devs wouldn't have been able to afford. Microsoft Store, it's a push-button process. So it's you do your submission, you push the button, it goes through, you get this little indication of the progress, and you get a report back, pass-fail. So that is the overview in a nutshell. We wanted to challenge ourselves as much as we possibly could. We wanted to spend our time as effectively as possible, and in our case, that was facilitated in large part by having a distribution platform partner like the Microsoft Store that could serve the function of a publisher in many senses. And of course, I can't emphasize enough the importance of localization to reaching that global audience. We're still in active development, of course. We've got a lot more techniques to learn and explore. MS has been rapidly evolving the capabilities of the store over the last couple of years, so I'm looking forward to seeing how that landscape changes, what we'll be able to leverage in the future. And again, on that note, when a little while after I'm finished, Bernardo here will step up to talk about what additional things the store can do and what the future holds, so just stick around for that. And that's it. I'll hang out for questions if there are any, but thanks for listening.
Question about Astroneer. How did you handle collision detection with procedural environment?
How do we handle collision detection with procedural environment? We only generate collision for a fairly small area around you. So it's the world has, and this is something that we're constantly looking at and changing, but we generate collision for some number of levels of LODs away from the player, and things that exceed that range, we freeze. They stop simulating physics.
So it's continuously generating it as you move into different sections.
Yeah. So it's the same thing, like when you're deforming the terrain, and it's constantly having to regenerate the geometry. The same exact process runs when new chunks come in. Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for listening.